Hello and welcome to the first installment. Hello, welcome to Call of the Wild 3. In this, we're going to be talking about Chapter 1, Part 1. One thing I want to make very clear, if you notice, and it may be hard to see in this font, but every time I write Call of the Wild, it's in italics, which indicates it's the title of a novel. So when you guys are referring to the title of this novel, you should either be underlining it or putting it in italics. Either or is absolutely fine. All right. For your learning targets today, we're going to be looking at basically how the actions in this story propel things and move the plot along while also revealing or changing aspects of the character of Buck. So basically, you're going to be reading this first part. You're going to see how Buck changes based on the treatment that he endures during his trip in the beginning. And you're also going to be making a prediction of how you think Buck's past treatment, living on Judge Miller's farm, might affect the way he is able to function and cope in the wild later on in our novel. All right, so first off, we need to look at what's the geography we're looking at for this section here. So Buck comes from Santa Clara Valley, which is right down here below San Francisco. All right. Giving a little bit of extra room to travel, we can assume that that would take probably about 31 hours to drive. It's a little over 2,000 miles. Essentially, we're going up here into Canada near where Dawson Creek is, and up above is into Alaska, up in this top area here, which is not shown. So you would be dealing with different types of geographical settings from both Canada and Alaska in this situation. So if this is about a day and a half drive in a car, imagine how long this is going to take by railroad with lots of frequent stops and starts, all right? This would take days if Buck's lucky, weeks depending on how long it takes them to unload and load and be sold off to different people. At one point, he's on a steamer, which means he's out here over the ocean, and sometimes he's on a carriage. So he's traveling for a very long amount of time in the beginning of this, and in the beginning couple of days. He is without food, without water. He's extremely scared. He's starting to lash out at people who are very abusive to him. So think about how this is going to affect him as a character, all right, and what this is going to do for him. That's basically where we're going to be starting with this novel. The next thing we have to look at, because Buck is stolen, so that's how he ends up in the Yukon, is how often were dogs actually stolen. So if you look at this bit over here from nps.gov, it says the scarcity of dogs made sale of these animals a lucrative business, and miners were willing to pay almost any price, and dogs brought fabulous sums in the Yukon during the winter of 1897 and 98. 1897 is when Buck is stolen, and that is when our story is taking place. So basically, this kind of tells you that dogs were big business. And if you were someone that didn't have a lot of money, well, you might be willing to steal yourself a dog if you could sell that dog for $300 to $400 a piece. Now, Buck is sold for about $150, depending on whether it's American money or Canadian money. But if we look at inflation rates, down here, $300 in 1897 is over $9,000 today. Keep this in mind, that is only for one dog. So if you could sell a dog for that much money when you didn't have to pay for him in the first place, then you could be a very wealthy person, and that would make you a decent amount of money. Now imagine each dog sled team is looking for up to 9 dogs, maybe, sometimes 6, sometimes 8, depending on the formation and whatnot. That could be a lot of money. All right. And by 1898, you had approximately 5,000 dogs arriving in Dawson City. And it sent, that market through the roof, and it made dogs readily available, but they weren't always gotten in honest ways. Also, over here, you have a newspaper article that talks about this gentleman, Harry Smith, stole a St. Bernard dog, which is very similar to what Buck is. His father was a St. Bernard. And he tried to sell him, but he was arrested. The dog itself was valued at $100. But the man was arrested before he could actually sell him. And I love this part down here. It says the dog will be present and he is subpoenaed, meaning the dog is ordered officially to be in court. Um, Probably to be looked at, during this whole situation. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but these things did happen. So for your assignment today, you're going to watch the video for Call of the Wild Chapter 1, Part 1. Now, as I said in the video, which you haven't watched yet, if you don't want to watch the video, that's fine. If you open the document, on the right-hand side of the document will be all the talking points that I will be discussing during the video. But if you would like to hear me reading the video or reading the novel to you and stopping and discussing it, you're more than welcome to chime into that. If you have the novel and you want to read along in the novel while you watch the video, that's fine too. It doesn't matter. Then you're going to answer the questions in your Schoology quiz. So keep in mind, you should pull up the actual document when you are doing your Schoology quiz so that you can go back into the text and answer questions. There's no excuse for getting matchings or multiple choice wrong because all the answers are in the text. You also have up to 3 chances to fix your mistake. So if you're not happy with your grade the first time, you can fix it and resubmit it. And it will always take the higher of the 2 grades, and that will be the final grade that you have. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to end this lesson for today. And the next thing you should do is pull up the video for Call of the Wild Chapter 1, Part 1, and answer your questions. Have a great day. Of Ch1 Reads Call of the Wild. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 1 into the primitive, and we're just going to be doing Part 1, the first half of the chapter. So as you can see, if you are opening and following along with the document, you're going to see this at the beginning here. This is just the different names for the chapters that we're going to come up with. We have 7 chapters total. Each of those chapters will be split into 2 parts. Part 1 will be done on Tuesdays. Part 2 will be done on Thursdays. You will always see up in the top of every single page of your document what chapter and what part we are in. And another couple of basic features over here on the left-hand side is going to be the text from the novel that I will be reading. On the right-hand side is the writing for the discussion points. So if you choose not to watch the videos, that's fine. All of the discussion points that we will be working on and talking about are going to be over on the right-hand side. If you are reading in a novel instead, then you won't have that information, but that's up to you. Another feature that you might also find is you'll have a word bolded in the text, and over on the right-hand side, you will have the definition for that word. Now, for those, I might not necessarily be stopping to discuss it, but sometimes I might if it relates to the conversation that we are going to be having. All right, and without further ado, we are going to read Chapter 1 into the primitive. Old longings nomadic leap, chafing at custom's chain. Again from its brummel sleep wakens the ferine strain. So basically, this is a really, really fancy way of saying no matter how domestic an animal is, it will always try to revert back to those wild or primitive instincts. So, for example, if you have cats, cats always try to hunt if there's mice or if there's, bugs or something like that. They can't ignore trying to hunt for things. It's a natural instinct for them, no matter how long we've kept them, domestic in our homes. They always try to go and revert back to that wild state. And that's basically what we're going to be looking at here in our novel is, in short, it's impossible to ignore the call of the wild. And that's what's going to happen with Buck, our lead dog. He starts out as a very domestic animal, as we're going to read in this first part. But then he ends up becoming wild by the end of the novel. All right, and in this first part, I'm just going to mention this first. They talk about finding yellow rocks, yellow metal, and that people are going to the Arctic and going to the Northland. This just means that they are talking about the Alaskan gold rush that you guys read about in your article from last week, just to give you a little bit of background information. Buck did not read the newspapers, or he would have known that trouble was brewing, not alone for himself, but for every tidewater dog strong of muscle and with warm, long hair from Puget Sound to San Diego. Because men groping in the Arctic darkness had found a yellow metal, and because steamships and transportation companies were booming the find, thousands of men were rushing into the Northland. These men wanted dogs, and the dogs they wanted were heavy dogs with strong muscles by which to toil and the furry coats to protect them from the frost. Buck lived at a big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley. Judge Miller's place, it was called. It stood back from the road, half hidden among the trees through which glimpses could be caught of the wide, cool veranda that ran around its four sides. The house was approached by gravel driveways which wound about through wide-spreading lawns and under the interlacing boughs of tall poplars. At the rear, things were on even a more spacious scale than at the front. There were great stables where a dozen grooms and boys held forth, rows of vine-clad servants' cottages, an endless and orderly array of outhouses, long grape arbors, green pastures, orchards, and berry patches. Then there was the pumping plant for the artisan well, and the big cement tank where the Judge Miller's boys took their morning plunge and kept cool in the hot afternoon. So this is all basically just describing Judge Miller's very large, very expensive estate where he lives, and this is where Buck is growing up. Um, in this last part, they're talking about like a natural spring. That's what they mean by an artisan spring. And basically, it's just a place where people go and they drink from it, from the clean water, and then they go and take a dip in almost like a pool. When it gets hot outside. And over this great demesne, Buck ruled. Here he was born, and here he had lived, and 4 years of his life. And it was true, there were other dogs, there could not but be other dogs on so vast a place, but they did not count. They came and went, resided in the populous kennels, or lived obscurely in the recesses of the house after the fashion of Toots, the Japanese pug, or Isabel, the Mexican hairless. Strange creatures that rarely put nose out of doors or set foot to ground. On the other hand, there were the fox terriers, a score of them at least, who yelped fearfully promises at Toots and Isabel, looking out of the windows at them and protected by a legion of housemaids armed with brooms and mops. So basically, they're just describing the other types of the animals that are on this farm and the other types of dogs specifically. So there's the very pampered inside dogs, Toots and Isabel. They're kind of like those little cute dogs that would be in somebody's purse nowadays that would be carried around, by fashionistas and stuff like that. Versus the fox terriers, which would most likely be working dogs, hunting dogs. They might be dogs that would be keeping mice and rats and things out of the barns and whatnot, but they definitely have more of a job to do than Toots and Isabel. But Buck was neither house dog nor kennel dog. The whole realm was his. He plunged into the swimming tank or went hunting with the judge's sons. He escorted Molly and Alice, the judge's daughters, on long twilight or early morning rambles. On wintry nights he lay at the judge's feet before the roaring library fire. He carried the judge's grandsons on his back or rolled them in the grass and guarded their footsteps through wild adventures down to the fountain in the stable yard, and even beyond where the paddocks were and the berry patches. Among the terriers he stalked imperiously, and Toots and Isabel he utterly ignored, for he was king. King over all creeping, crawling, flying things of Judge Miller's place, humans included. So basically what they're saying here is Buck was the family dog. He was loved by all members of the family. He, pretty much was the ruler of the roost. He oversaw everything. He was the king of all animals on this farm, and he was treated like it. His father Elmo, a huge Saint Bernard, had been the judge's inseparable companion, and Buck bid fair to follow in the way of his father. He was not so large. He weighed only 140 pounds, for his mother, Shep, had been a Scotch shepherd dog. Nevertheless, 140 pounds, to which was added the dignity that comes of good living and universal respect, enabled him to carry himself in a right royal fashion. During the 4 years since his puppyhood he had lived the life of a sated aristocrat. He had a fine pride in himself, was even a trifle egotistical, as country gentlemen sometimes become because of their insular situation. But he had saved himself by not becoming a mere pampered house dog. Hunting and kindred outdoor delights had kept down the fat and hardened his muscles, and to him, as to the cold, tubbing races, the love of water had been a tonic and a health preserver. Basically, he lives like a prince. He is a little egotistical, meaning he's kind of full of himself. He's very proud of himself. He looks down on all the other dogs. But he's not just one of those lazy, spoiled rich dogs who sits around and does nothing like Toots and Isabel. He actually goes outside. He accompanies the kids on walks. He kind of rambles over all of the farm. So he's not fat and lazy. He's a very muscular dog, which would make him a very ideal dog for sledding, and for what's about ready to happen here. And this was the manner of dog Buck was in the fall of 1897, when the Klondike strike dragged men from all the world into the frozen North. But Buck did not read the newspapers, and he did not know that Manuel, one of the gardener's helpers, was an undesirable acquaintance. Manuel had one besetting sin: he loved to play Chinese lottery. Also in his gambling he had one besetting weakness: faith in a system, and this made his damnation certain. For to play the system requires money, while the wages of a gardener's helper do not overlap the needs of a wife and numerous progeny. So what this means is Manuel has a gambling problem. So therefore, he can't take care of his wife and his kids if he's spending all his money on lottery. So he's going to need money, foreshadowing possibly by stealing Buck and selling him? Absolutely. The judge was at a meeting of the Raisin Growers Association, and the boys were busy organizing an athletic club on the memorable night of Manuel's treachery. No one saw him and Buck go off through the orchard on what Buck imagined was merely a stroll, and with the exception of a solitary man, no one saw them arrive at the little flag station known as College Park. This man talked with Manuel, and money chinked between them. "You might wrap up the goods before you deliver 'em," the stranger said gruffly, and Manuel doubled a piece of stout rope around Buck's neck under the collar. "Twist it, and you'll choke him plenty," said Manuel, and the stranger grunted a ready affirmative. Buck had accepted the rope with quiet dignity. To be sure, it was an unwonted performance, but he had learned to trust in men he knew, and to give them credit for a wisdom that outreached his own. But when the ends of the rope were placed on the stranger's hands, he growled menacingly. He had merely intimated his displeasure, in his pride believing that to intimate was to command. But to his surprise the rope tightened around his neck, shutting off his breath. In quick rage he sprang at the man, who met him halfway, grappled him close by the throat, and with a deft twist threw him over on his back. Then the rope tightened mercilessly, while Buck struggling in fury, his tongue lolling out of his mouth and his great chest panting futilely. Never in all of his life had he been so vilely treated, and never in all of his life had he been so angry. But his strength ebbed, his eyes glazed, and he knew nothing when the train was flagged and the two men threw him into the baggage car. So Buck is willing to go with Manuel because he trusts Manuel. He knows him. He's grown up around him, and he's never had a reason to not trust him. Buck's always been treated kindly, and with fairness by all the people he's encountered. However, when Buck is changed hands to this other person, he gets very suspicious and very fearful of that. Unfortunately, he doesn't really have a choice in this point, because now this man is the first person outside of the ranch that he's ever encountered, and this person is abusive to him. He has the rope, he tightens it around his neck, he's essentially choking this poor dog, so he has no choice but to give in and go with him, almost to the point where he is blacked out and stuck into the train and wakes up in the train, not knowing what happened. The next he knew, he was dimly aware that his tongue was hurting, and that he was being jolted along in some kind of conveyance. The hoarse shriek of a locomotive whistling at crossing told him where he was. He had traveled too often with the judge not to know the sensation of riding in a baggage car. He opened his eyes, and into them came the unbridled anger of a kidnapped king. The man sprang for his throat, but Buck was too quick for him. His jaws closed on the hand, nor did they relax till his senses were choked out of him once more. "Yep, has fits," the man said, hiding his mangled hand from the baggageman, who had been attracted by the sounds of struggle. "I'm taking him up for the boss to Frisco. Crack dog, doctor. There he thinks he can cure him." Concerning that night's ride, the man spoke most eloquently for himself, in a little shed back of saloon on the San Francisco waterfront. So basically, everyone here is willing to trust this man because why would they have a reason not to? So instead of thinking that there might be a problem with the dog and the dog's fighting back, they automatically trust what this man has to tell them, even though he is a little drunk and even still speaking well for himself. "All I get is 50 for it," he grumbled, "and I wouldn't do it over for 1,000 cold cash." His hand was wrapped in a bloody handkerchief, and the right trouser leg was ripped from knee to ankle. "How much did the other mug get?" the saloon keeper demanded. "100," was the reply. "Wouldn't take a sou less, so help me." A sou, by the way, I forgot to put this in, is a French form of currency, so these might be French Canadian men that are talking right now. "That makes 150," the saloon keeper calculated, "and he's worth it, or I'm a squarehead." The kidnapper undid the bloody wrappings and looked at his lacerated hand. "If I don't get the hydrophoby, it'll be because you was born to hang," laughed the saloon keeper. "Here, lend me a hand before you pull your freight," he added. Dazed and suffering intolerable pain from the throat and tongue, with the life half throttled out of him, Buck attempted to face his tormentors. But he was thrown down and choked repeatedly till they succeeded in filing the heavy the heavy brass collar from his neck. Then the rope was removed, and he was flung into a cage-like crate. There he lay for the remainder of the weary night, nursing his wrath and wounded pride. He could not understand what it all meant. What did they want with him, these strange men? Why were they keeping him pent up in this narrow crate? He did not know why, but he felt oppressed by the vague sense of impending calamity. Several times during the night he sprang to his feet when the shed door rattled open, expecting to see the judge, or the boys at least. But each time it was the bulging face of the saloon keeper that peered in at him by the sickly light of a tallow candle. And each time the joyful bark that trembled in Buck's throat was twisted into a savage growl. But the saloon keeper let him alone, and in the morning 4 men entered and picked up the crate. More tormentors, Buck decided, for they were evil-looking creatures, ragged and unkempt, and he stormed and raged at them through the bars. They only laughed and poked sticks at him, which he promptly assailed with his teeth, till he realized that that was what they wanted, whereupon he lay down sullenly and allowed the crate to be lifted into a wagon. Then he and the crate in which he was imprisoned began a passage through many hands. Clerks in the express office took charge of him. He was carted about in another wagon. A truck carried him, with an assortment of boxes and parcels, upon a ferry steamer. He was trucked off the steamer into a great railway depot, and finally he was deposited in an express car. So this is just basically talking about all of the different hands that Buck passes through on his way from California to Alaska. And when he keeps getting met by mean and angry people, they taunt him and they tease him, and he gives in to that by trying to bite back and bite at the sticks that they're poking at him. But in the end, he realizes that's what they're trying to get from him, so he just sits down and lets them take him. He doesn't really have much he can do at this point. For 2 days and nights this express car was dragged along at the tail of shrieking locomotives, and for 2 days and nights Buck neither ate nor drank. In his anger he had met the first advances of the express messengers with growls, and they had retaliated by teasing him. When he flung himself against the bars, quivering and frothing, they laughed at him and taunted him. They growled and barked like a detestable dogs, mewed and flapped their arms and crowed. It was all very silly, he knew, but therefore the more outrage to his dignity, and his anger waxed and waxed. He did not mind the hunger so much, but the lack of water caused him severe suffering and fanned his wrath to fever pitch. For the matter high strung and finely sensitive, the ill treatment had flung him into a fever which was fled by the inflammation of his parched and swollen throat and tongue. He was glad for one thing. The rope was off his neck. That had given them an unfair advantage, but now that it was off, he would show them. They would never get another rope around his neck. Upon that he was resolved. For 2 days and nights he neither ate nor drank, and during those 2 days and nights of torment he accumulated a fund of wrath that boded ill for whoever first fell foul of him. His eyes turned bloodshot, and he was metamorphosed into a raging fiend. So changed was he that the judge himself would not have recognized him, and the express messengers breathed with relief when they bundled him off the train at Seattle. So basically, Buck is being treated very badly. He's being kept in a small crate. He's not being fed. He's not given water. He can deal with the hunger, but the thing that's making him angrier and angrier and angrier is the lack of water. And he's basically building up this store of revenge so that he will snap at the first person that he comes in contact with when he gets out of this box. So everyone is happy to see him go when they don't have to deal with him anymore. All right, so this is the end of part 1. Now you're going to answer the questions on Schoology. Remember, you have the document at your disposal, so you can open that and use it to answer questions. If you want it and you have the document in front of you, if you scroll down, all of the questions are down here. If you want to answer them first on here and then do the work on Schoology, you can. You don't have to. You just have to do one. Also keep in mind, when you do the work on Schoology, if it tells you you got some wrong, you can go back in and resubmit up to 2 times. So there's no reason you can't get 100. So if you go through and you do it the first time and you get, let's say, 4 wrong, you can go back into the document and find all the information that you need, because you've got it right here, and you can go back up and look for the answers. All right, so please do your best. Take pride in your work. Remember, this is now being counted and graded. So try to stay on top of these. You only have 2 a week, and we will cover the rest of this on Thursday. So until then, have a good day.